Welcome back, everybody, to this Intro to X Particles series. And in this video, we're going to be talking about modifiers. This is part 3 in this series. And in part 1, we did a brief overview of what a particle is. And in part 2, we talked about the emitter. And in this video, we're going to be talking about, we're going to give an introduction into modifiers. And modifiers and X particles is really like a big subject. So it actually took me a while to think about how to sort of encapsulate this into an introduction video that's not, just going through all the tons of modifiers and saying this one does this and this one does this. So like the other videos, again, this is just going to be kind of an introduction to get you to wrap your head around exactly how modifiers work sort of broadly in the kind of like macro. And in the future, if that's something that people are interested in, I can go into detail on specific modifiers. I probably will make a specific project, and in the course of me making some particular thing, I'll use modifiers. I think it's probably more valuable to actually see the modifiers in context for making final effects to really get a good idea of when to use what modifier. So that's probably going to be my approach. But you guys feel free to let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. But for this video, we're just going to be, again, talking about modifiers broadly. So let's jump right in. So the first thing I'm going to do is make an emitter. And I'm really just going to be making this to so that we can just get some particles out, and so that we can see a good visual representation of what I'm talking about. I'm going to make a circle emitter, and I am going to turn this to ring only. That means that we're just going to emit from this actual little circle. I'm going to change the cone angle here to 90 degrees, and what that's going to give us is just this flat radial emission, like that. And then I'm going to take this circle and I'm just going to give this disk radius a radius of 0. So now we've just got this emitting again on a flat plane in sort of like 2 dimensions. And I'm going to emit a lot more particles. Let's see what, maybe like 50,000 looks like. That looks pretty good. All right, so then we're going to make our first modifier. So we're just going to add probably what's going to be your most used modifier in general, which is just a turbulence modifier, which is going to manipulate the particle's movement in sort of like a general sense. So if we just add that, and without tweaking any parameters, let's just see what that does. We can see that without this, the particles emitted in just a perfect circle. And the way that I sort of introduced you all, if you watched my previous videos into this, we basically said that a particle is just a point in space that has a bunch of attributes sort of associated with it. And the initial values for those attributes are going to be defined by the emitter. So these particles have a speed of 150, got a radius of 3, they've got a color of this light blue. So we've got these attributes and they're filled with some default values. This modifier, as the name suggests, is going to modify some of those values. So when we turn this on, can see again, this is a perfect circle, and we press play, no longer a perfect circle. Okay, so now we can see we've got some variation in there. So I'm going to I'm going to change some of the parameters in here. I say modify the modifier, but I'm going to change this from simplex to Voronoi. I'm going to increase the strength up to about 15, and let's just see what that does. So that just gives us a different turbulence, basically something that's a bit more apparent. Then I'm also going to go into the emitter, go into display, and under the color mode, I'm going to change this to gradient parameter. And so this is going to map, I'm going to say, the speed, which parameter do we want to map to this gradient? We want to map the speed. And again, let's just see what that looks like. All right, so you can see that this is very, very, very dominant towards the white. And that's because the mapping of this, and when we say mapping, because we're going to get into this when we talk about mapping here in this modifier, this is one of the things we're going to cover. But what we're doing right here, which is built into the emitter, this is mapping also. And when I say mapping, I'm talking about data mapping. And what data mapping is controlling one attribute with another attribute and taking the values of one attribute and mapping them across a range of values for a different attribute. And so the reason that we say mapping is because when you have attributes that have, sort of like a different value scale, like you might have an attribute where the scale of values that it has goes from 0 to 1, and then you might have another attribute where the scale of values for it goes from 0 to 300, and you basically want the sort of percentage of 0 to 100% to be equal across both of those value ranges. And so with mapping, that's essentially what we're doing. We're basically normalizing that value range to be sort of like a 0 to 100 range across both of those value ranges. So the 0 to 1 will be the same thing as 0 to 300. So in this case, what we're doing is we're taking this color range from this dark blue to white, and we're saying map that over a speed value of 0 to 100. Okay. So the fastest particles are going to be white, and as the particles become slower, they're going to be blue. But the top speed that it's going to map is 100. So what we're seeing here is an indication that the vast majority of these particles are already moving faster than 100 centimeters per second. I don't know, whatever 100, whatever that value is actually associated with. So let's increase that to maybe like 300. Okay, and then we get something like this. That's maybe a little bit more. We want to get maybe some white in there, so that we've got like a nice sort of spread, and we can really sort of see what's happening with the speed of our particles. And this is really just like the introduction to mapping in a modifier. Okay. And this is also just showing what ultimately a modifier, what this modifier, turbulence, does. And all modifiers are going to just do something. Some of them might affect the movement of the particles. You can have modifiers that affect the colors of a particle. You can have modifiers that are going to affect every single attribute that you have in a particle. Remember from the previous videos, a particle is just a point in space with a bunch of attributes. And modifiers are things that are going to modify those attributes usually over time. In some cases that it doesn't necessarily work that way, but they're going to modify those attributes in one way or another. So let's get into some of the things that some of the controls that you're going to have across the board for modifiers. Each modifier obviously is going to have, under the object tab, is going to have the specific parameters for that modifier, like you see right here in turbulence. I picked this one because it's just kind of straightforward and easy to understand. So you have your parameters that are for the particular modifier. Depending on the modifier that you use, some of these are really straightforward and easy to understand, like turbulence, or say like a kill XP or NX, in this case kill modifier. This just kills particles once they go beyond this boundary. So let's just move this in a little bit. Press play, and you can see what happens. Very straightforward, doesn't have a ton of parameters, really easy to understand. Some things are like that. Some things are a little bit harder to understand, to wrap your head around. And, the documentation is a good spot to really kind of go through and see, like, for every single modifier, like, what does this thing actually do? But like I said, things that are going to be, that you're going to sort of see across all the different modifiers, the particular attributes for the parameters for the modifier. Then you're also going to have this groups affected, mapping, and fields. So I'm actually going to start with fields because this one is really easy and straightforward and easy to understand. So just like fields everywhere else in Cinema 4D, the fields here are going to, in the simplest way that they can be used, limit the effect to a particular field. So if we just make a spherical field, and I'm going to make this, a bit smaller, maybe about right there, and press play. And what you'll see is that the turbulence effect is only happening inside this circle. Let's make it a bit bigger. So once it gets out of that circle, they're just moving on the speed change that they had within the circle. So you can see that if we turn this off, that actually turns off the entire effect. So let's turn this off. There we go. And so that's with it off. So the particles are always getting this turbulence effect. And if we turn this on, then they only get this effect when they're inside this circle. If we invert this, then they start getting that effect once they escape the circle. So if we make this a bit bigger, like so, then we can really see very clearly that point at which they start getting impacted by the turbulence field. Let's give ourselves a bit more frames. And I'm going to go into the emitter and just make these particles die after a while, so it's not just totally a big thing full of particles, but yeah, something like that. Okay, so since this isn't a talk about fields, but hopefully maybe you already kind of have an idea of what fields do. They do the same thing with X particles. Okay, so that's pretty easy and straightforward. So then we have mapping. And the introduction to mapping was what I just showed you with the color that we have. And so here we just mapped color to speed, but with every modifier, you can also map some sort of particle attribute to one of the parameters inside the modifier. So let's look at an example. And let's go in here and let's take the color brightness. You can also layer these and add multiple things in here and layer them up. I'm not going to get into that level of complexity, but just a simple sort of demonstration. Okay, so right now, what we're saying is we want to map the color brightness to the strength. Okay, so here we've got our strength with the set, which is set to 15, and we're going to map color brightness to that. So without changing anything, if we just press play, we don't see a huge difference. So I'm going to go in to, just to make this more apparent, let's go in here and I am going to change this to be a black and white gradient that we have our speed map to. Still really can't see anything. So let's go in and let's look at what we've got here. So this part says range min is 0, range max is 1, and then we've got this little thing, this little curve right here. So right now, the y-axis here is the parameter from the modifier. So the y-axis here is the strength, and the x-axis is the mapped to parameter. So the x-axis is the color brightness. So a value of 0, which means we can say that's black, gets no strength from the turbulence. So black particles aren't going to be affected by the turbulence at all. And as we go up to white particles, they are going to get the full impact of the turbulence. So let's actually take this and let's say that we want full strength on black and 0 on the white. Okay, we're basically getting sort of like nothing happening. But if we go in here and let's change this gradient, you can see what we're getting now. So black particles have the full strength and white particles don't have any. So let's make some more modifications. So we can adjust this curve to something like this. So that we actually, let's come in here. Let's bring this down a little bit. Okay. And just to make this really, really obvious, I'm going to make this a linear curve. Control click here. Actually, well, let's see. You know what we want to do? Instead of mapping this to speed, let's take this and just say gradient random. So that, because basically particles have to be moving at a certain speed to even to get the white value. So let's just give each particle a random value along here so that we can see what that does. There we go. That's kind of what I wanted to see. And now if we take this, so this is already, yeah, pretty much what I was thinking. Try and make this as much as possible. Like you can see that it's only the white particles that are not being affected. And from black to gray, all of these are getting 100% of the turbulence, and just these white particles are not getting any sort of, because you remember that when we turn this off, this is the effect. It just looks like a perfect circle getting emitted and then disappearing because we have these particles just living for 90 frames. And so now when we turn this on, everything gets the effect except for the pure white particles. So if we come in here and say, if we move this, then there's going to be less pure white particles. And so you can see that now more particles are getting the turbulence effect. So out of context, it can be hard to, to see exactly like, okay, that's hopefully it's clear what's happening here with that we're just mapping and controlling one thing with another thing. But out of context, it's kind of hard to see where that might be useful. But take my word for it, mapping is super useful. And once you kind of wrap your head around it, it becomes a really powerful tool for, say, the kind of like when effects start to get a little bit more complex, mapping becomes really, really, really powerful. And that's how that works. Okay, so let's get rid of that. I am going to actually go back here and let's get a different, do this one. And I'm going to put this back to speed. Just so we've got something. Ew, it's kind of ugly looking. Let's do this again. Yeah, we'll stick with this one. Okay. So then we've got groups affected. Groups are again a big topic in X particles. In a nutshell, groups are going to allow you to break your particle sim, like all the particles that you have emitted here. You can break that up into groups of particles, and then the point of that is that you can affect the particles differently depending on which group they're in. So it allows you, it's sort of like making a selection in, whatever, in some other software scenario like that you think about in digital stuff. Being able to sort of make a selection for some particles. So in order to use that, we have to first create some groups. So if we go into the emitter, go under groups, and this create and add a group, if you hold down Control and click this a couple of times, the reason that you hold down Control is because if you don't hold down Control and you press this, then it switches this thing, and then you have to come back and click the emitter again, which is kind of annoying. So holding down Control just doesn't switch here. So let's go here to group 2, and let's just switch this to a single color. Yeah, let's make it red. I think this is actually a bit weird in the latest versions of X particles where we're using the NX particles. I've kind of run into some weird issues with groups where things in the viewport, like the groups are being switched and particles are being assigned to groups, but it's not always behaving right in the viewport. Let's see if that happens, because right now this is set to assign particles to groups randomly. So let's just see if that works. It does. Okay, so that's working. So basically what we have here is that roughly like half of these particles are being assigned to group 1 and half of them are being assigned to group 2. So group 1 is this same gradient parameter that's mapped to speed, and group 2 is just a solid red color. So that's why you can see that these are that's why they look like this, because one's the first group, one's the second group. Okay, so here we can just say, I only want the turbulence to affect group 1. So now what you're going to see is that group 2 doesn't get affected by the turbulence, and group 1 does. So this is kind of a similar effect to what we just did the previous time with the mapping. And depending on what you do or what you want to do, you'll eventually get the hang of like what's going to be the best scenario to use which thing. Obviously, I was really just showing what it worked. It wasn't like a practical example for that mapping, but really just kind of showing what it is and how it works. So similarly, with each modifier, you can limit the effect of that modifier with a group. And there's a couple of different ways to assign particles to a group. As you just saw, within the emitter, you can say just randomly pick a group. You can say, and this is what typically is usually when I'm using groups, the way that I'm using it is I'm saying first group only. So what does that mean? So basically what's going to happen is that all the particles are going to be in the first group. Then, based on some sort of condition being met, particles will get moved into group 2. So the different situations of like what potentially could be triggered to make that happen, it's sort of like, practically infinite. But just for the sake of just showing you sort of like that in action, I'm just, I'm not going to try and imagine an imaginary scenario just so this video doesn't become way too long and bogged down in those details. But just a quick example of particles originate in sort of like originator group, then something happens and they get pushed into the second group. So a very simple example of this, and I will go ahead and talk about this. I don't want to get too far on too many tangents, but there's two different types of modifiers in or two sort of like different sets of modifiers now in X particles. There's the NX modifiers, which are the new GPU accelerated modifiers, and then there's all the other sort of like older CPU based modifiers. So within the NX modifiers, okay, so previously in the old modifiers, you have this questions tab in here, and a question is essentially just like a condition. So you can add a question like, is the particle age greater than 90 frames? And then if that condition is met, you can do something. Okay, so that's sort of like the older way of doing that. Within the NX particles, there's a question object here. So in this case, for this example, I'm going to use this because I'm using NX stuff right now. So I'm going to create a question object, and the question that I'm going to ask, you got to ask a question. It can basically be the same thing. I'm going to just try and keep this really simple. So is the particle's age greater than 30 frames? Okay, so if that condition is true, then we're going to add an action. We're going to not set the color. We're going to set the group to group 2. Okay. So now if we press play, it's not doing anything. Okay, so let's see. Do we need to click this? So this might be that situation that I was talking about where the groups, so what I'm expecting to see is that after 30 frames, these guys should turn red, okay? But that's not happening. So this is something that I have run into. So let's come in here and let's actually add a gravity modifier. This is another one of the really easy to understand and straightforward modifiers. And in the groups affected here, I'm just going to say only affect group 2. So this will actually let us know if the question is working, because at 30 frames, these particles will just start to fall. And you can see that it is actually working. Yeah, I'm not sure what's up with that. I think that it's a limitation of the NX modifiers, that the visuals in the viewport don't don't update, which is really sucks, unfortunately. But the groups are changing. Now, let me just see if we do that the old way. So let's come in here and let's add a question. Particle age is blah, blah, blah. So let's say greater than 30 frames. Then we can add an action, and we are going to do a direct action. This is a bit of a tangent, but it's too late. So we're going to do a change group. The new group is going to be group 2. And we want to change the color and the editor display. Cool. All right, so let's see if that works. That is not working. Interesting. So I wonder if that might just not work when you're using NX stuff, which is, that kind of sucks, because that's good functionality to have. Anyway, okay, so I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole, but let's just go back a few things here. Okay, so back here, and we can see anyway that how, because ultimately what we just wanted to show was that within the modifiers, you got this groups affected, and you can basically affect which particles are being affected by a modifier by restraining the particles affect only to certain groups. Okay. So yeah, you can see that the condition is met and the particles change group to group 2. Again, like some different things, you can have that trigger just so that to get your sort of imagination going. Some examples of things that you can do to then trigger a change group of particles: a color change, a speed change, a radius change, any sort of, basically all these attributes that I sort of introduced right when we first started talking about this. If we go into the not that one, it's the, is it the console? No, it is the console. Yeah, it is the console. Okay. And so basically all this stuff: age, color, lifespan, mass, fuel, blah, 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 position, all this different stuff, particle position, all these different things can all trigger a group change. And once you trigger that group change, then you can have a whole different set of modifiers affecting those particles in a completely different way, which that can lead to lots and lots and lots of cool and powerful effects. Okay, so yeah, my goal here for this video was to keep this not be super long, have it just be an introduction. And yeah, I think that is good for an introduction into modifiers and how they work. That's the basic idea. In summary, a particle is a point in space with a bunch of attributes. An emitter creates particles and typically is going to give, assign some default values into those attributes. Modifiers in general are going to change, manipulate, and guess what? Modify those attributes. Within each modifier, you're going to have a few standard ways of controlling the application of that modifier, which is general general Cinema 4D fields, which is data mapping and controlling controlling some sort of parameter within that modifier with some other data from somewhere else. And then also controlling and restricting that modifier's effects through groups. And yeah, that's the basics of modifiers within X particles. We will continue to build on this stuff and kind of build our way up to actually doing sort of effects. I think that one of the things that I wanted to do next was just kind of, because I really kind of want to get people that don't know anything up and running to making something cool and also understanding what they're doing. So I think that the next thing that I'm going to do is going to be talking about actually rendering particles, and so that you can just kind of take this is the foundation. You'll need to take what you've learned in these first 3 videos, and then you can kind of, with that as a foundation, start to build on and again, just kind of look at the documentation and, but this will allow you to kind of put that stuff into proper context of like what all this stuff is and how it all works together. And next I want to get into just actually rendering particles with different render engines. I'm probably going to start with Octane because that's where I'm most comfortable. But then after that, I'll do Redshift. And yeah, we'll kind of next step, just get into actually being able to take this and start making pretty pictures with it. Start making some cool looking stuff before we go down the road of kind of actually creating, a little bit more complicated effects. So if that sounds interesting to you, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. I've gotten a lot of new subscribers, lots of people showing a lot of love. I really appreciate that. So yeah, there will be more to come. Like and subscribe, all that jazz. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.